In 1979, the entire Vietnamese nation became aware of the border war that lasted 16 days. When China launched its first invasion, but few people know that it was not the last time. Just a few years later, China launched a second invasion, this time lasting many years, with far greater bloodshed, and centered on one of the fiercest battles in modern Vietnamese history, the Battle of Vai Xuyen. This battle was even more brutal than the Battle of Quang Tri Citadel, one of the most intense confrontations during the war against the United States. Here, tens of thousands of young Vietnamese soldiers fell along the border, amid thunderous artillery fire and mountains stained red with blood. How did that war unfold? Why did China choose Vai Xuyen? And what made this battle a symbol of silent sacrifice, rarely told in history? Part 1: The Second Invasion of Vietnam by the People's Republic of China. When mentioning the Northern Border War, most Vietnamese remember February 17, 1979, when China mobilized more than 600,000 troops to cross the border and attack 6 northern provinces. That war lasted only 16 days, ending in devastation and loss, and is remembered as a lesson in national defense vigilance. However, it was not the last invasion. In 1984, another conflict erupted. This time it was not loud, not widely reported, and did not draw strong international attention, but in the jagged limestone mountains of Vai Xuyen district, Ha Giang province, a brutal and prolonged war broke out, lasting until 1989. This was China's second invasion, not aimed at major cities but at seizing each meter of border land and each strategic high point. China did not attack in massive waves. Instead, it used gradual tactics, building bunkers, occupying hilltops, and launching constant artillery bombardments, forcing Vietnamese forces to withdraw deeper inland. The peak came on May 12, 1984, when tens of thousands of artillery shells rained down on Vietnamese-controlled heights such as Hill 1509, Hill 772, and Hill 685, marking the beginning of the Battle of Vai Xuyen. Many veterans later said this battle was even more intense than the 1972 Battle of Quang Tri. Yet for many years, it was rarely mentioned publicly. Many young people today have never heard of Vai Xuyen as a battlefield. In reality, it was once a place of immense sacrifice, where more than 4,000 Vietnamese soldiers fell in forests and mountains, where life and death were separated by only a narrow ridge or a single misstep. It was a real battle. People fell, blood soaked into stone, yet it seemed erased from collective memory. It is time to restore its place in history so that those who fell will not be forgotten. Part 2: The Fiercest Battle in Modern Vietnamese History. When people think of the fiercest battle in modern Vietnamese history, they often recall Quang Tri Citadel in 1972. With 81 days and nights under relentless bombardment, every square meter of land there was soaked with blood. But at Vai Xuyen, from 1984 to 1989, the war lasted longer, was more brutal, and carried an even deeper sense of tragedy, yet remained largely silent in public awareness. Vietnamese soldiers faced artillery bombardments even heavier than those at Quang Tri, in terrain far more dangerous. On July 12, 1984, Chinese artillery fired tens of thousands of shells in just hours, leveling mountain peaks in the Tay Con Lin range. Some days saw more than 20,000 shells fired, turning entire mountains into firestorms where survival was possible only by hiding in rock crevices. Unlike Quang Tri, which was fought on relatively flat terrain, Vai Xuyen was a battle for mountain heights between 1.200 and 1.800 meters above sea level. A single artillery strike could wipe out an entire platoon. Vietnamese soldiers lived by the phrase, clinging to the rocks in life, turning into stone in death. This was both literal and symbolic. Many soldiers fell in rock crevices where their bodies could not be recovered, becoming part of the mountains forever. Entire companies and battalions were wiped out in counterattacks. Some soldiers carried only a small paper with their name and hometown, so their comrades could notify their families if they died. Many were not yet 20 years old, an age of dreams and first love. Unlike Quang Tri, which was commemorated in literature and monuments, Vai Xuyen remained largely hidden in silence. Yet that silence itself turned it into a legend carved into rock, forest, and memory. Part 3: Why China chose Vai Xuyen. In 1979, China attacked across the entire northern border, from Lang Son to Lai Chau. But in 1984, it focused on a single location, Vai Xuyen. This decision reflected strategic calculation. First, Vai Xuyen was a gateway to northern Vietnam, controlling heights such as Hills 1509, 685, and 772 allowed dominance over surrounding valleys and threatened deeper territory. Capturing these positions would give China long-term strategic leverage. Second, Vietnam in the early 1980s was heavily strained. It was engaged in conflict along the southwestern border in Cambodia and faced international embargoes. China likely saw an opportunity to apply pressure while Vietnam's resources were stretched thin. Third, focusing on a remote mountainous area limited international attention. A localized conflict could be framed as a border dispute rather than a major invasion. China built fortified artillery positions, tunnels, and supply routes from Yunnan province, enabling sustained operations. This strategy resembled gradual territorial pressure rather than a single decisive assault. It was a war without formal declaration, quiet in diplomacy, but devastating on the battlefield. Part 4: Forces, Weapons, and the Reality of Combat. Many people consider Quang Tri Citadel to be the most heavily bombarded battlefield in Vietnamese history, with over 328.000 artillery shells fired in 81 days. But at Vai Xuyen, between 1984 and 1989, more than 2 million artillery shells were fired. Some days saw over 10.00 shells in just hours, making it one of the most heavily bombarded areas in modern Vietnamese military history. China deployed heavy artillery such as 130mm and 152mm guns, rocket artillery, flamethrowers, snipers, and engineering units to destroy fortifications and advance positions. Vietnamese forces, despite limited equipment, maintained continuous resistance. Weapons and supplies had to be carried on foot through steep mountains and dense forests. Soldiers built bunkers manually, using earth and stone, and endured extreme shortages. Units such as the 356th Division, the 313th Division, the 316th Division, and the 312th Division became symbols of endurance. They fought for years, holding and retaking strategic heights including Hills 1509, 772, 685, and others. Some battles lasted less than an hour but resulted in devastating casualties. Many soldiers were never recovered. Their names remain unaccounted for. Their resting place is unknown. At Quang Tri, soldiers fought to defend a historic city. At Vai Xuyen, they fought for every meter of border land. One was a citadel, the other was a mountain. But the bloodshed carried the same meaning: sovereignty. If Quang Tri was an open battlefield, Vai Xuyen was a hidden one, concealed by mountains and time. The Second Chinese Invasion and the Battle of Vai Xuyen remain among the most intense and prolonged conflicts in modern Vietnamese history. For 5 years, from 1984 to 1989, artillery thundered across remote mountain ridges, and soldiers on both sides endured some of the harshest combat conditions imaginable. For Vietnam, it was a defensive struggle to protect sovereignty, fought not in major cities but on isolated peaks where every ridge, trench, and rock carried strategic importance. The men who fought there were often very young, carrying supplies on their backs, holding positions under relentless bombardment, and fighting for terrain measured not in kilometers, but in meters. Yet despite its scale and human cost, the Battle of Vai Xuyen has remained far less known than other wars. There are several reasons for this relative silence. First, the conflict took place in a remote mountainous region, far from major population centers and international media. Unlike earlier wars that unfolded in cities or politically visible areas, Vai Xuyen was hidden behind steep ridges and dense forests, limiting public visibility. Second, the war was never formally declared. It was considered a prolonged border conflict rather than a conventional war, because it did not involve sweeping offensives across large provinces as in 1979. It attracted less global diplomatic attention and fewer official wartime narratives. Third, the geopolitical context of the 1980s played a major role. Vietnam was simultaneously involved in Cambodia and faced economic isolation and international sanctions. Maintaining stability and focusing on reconstruction became national priorities. Public discussion of ongoing border fighting was often limited, partly to control escalation and partly to maintain diplomatic flexibility during a sensitive period in regional relations. Fourth, normalization of relations between Vietnam and China in the early 1990s also contributed to the quiet treatment of the conflict. As both countries moved toward restoring diplomatic and economic ties, emphasis shifted toward future cooperation rather than revisiting the most painful chapters of confrontation. Finally, many of the battlefields themselves remained dangerous and inaccessible for years, slowing memorial efforts and historical documentation. Some soldiers' remains were never recovered, and their stories survived mainly through veterans' memories rather than widespread public recognition. But silence does not erase significance. The Battle of Vai Xuyen stands as a testament to endurance, sacrifice, and the determination to defend national borders under extreme conditions. It represents a chapter of history shaped not by large headlines, but by the quiet resilience of those who held their ground. Today, remembering Vai Xuyen is not only about recalling a battlefield, it is about acknowledging those who stood there, understanding the complexity of that period, and ensuring that their sacrifice remains part of the historical record for future generations.